The laugh heard around the world. The lights in the studio glared down like miniature suns, bright and unrelenting. Cameras stood silently like towering monoliths, their blinking red eyes recording every breath, every twitch. The atmosphere buzzed with an electric excitement, a collision of nerves, anticipation, and just a hint of skepticism. At the center of it all sat Sundar Pichai, wearing his characteristic calm smile, the kind that suggested deep rivers ran beneath seemingly still waters. His navy blue suit was crisp but understated, much like the man himself, a man more interested in quiet achievement than loud celebration. Across from him, the reporter, Daniel Hartman, shuffled his notes, his grin just a little too wide, his demeanor a little too casual for a primetime interview with one of the world's most respected tech leaders. "All right, Sundar," Daniel said, his voice carrying the tone of a man preparing for something amusing. "We all know you lead Google, manage countless employees, and basically oversee the future of technology. But between us," he leaned in, chuckling lightly, "you didn't exactly grow up coding robots in Silicon Valley garages, did you?" The audience tittered, sensing the reporter's lightly mocking undertone. Sundar merely smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling in a way that suggested he had seen and survived many such moments before. "You grew up. Where was it?" "Chennai." "And what was it like, running to school barefoot, sending emails on a clay tablet?" Daniel quipped, the laughter from the live audience swelling to a roar. Sundar's smile didn't waver. His heart didn't race. He had long ago learned that when people laughed at him, they revealed more about themselves than they did about him. He waited for the laughter to fade, gently clasping his hands on the table, and then spoke. "Yes," Sundar began, his voice even and warm. "I grew up in Chennai, in a modest home. In fact, for the first part of my childhood, we didn't even have a telephone." The audience quieted a little, sensing a shift. "And you're right. I wasn't programming computers at age 5. I didn't have a computer at all. But I had something better." Daniel raised an eyebrow, curious despite himself. "I had questions," Sundar continued. "I had endless curiosity. I would look at a telephone and wonder, how could a voice travel through a wire? How could pressing buttons send messages across cities? I didn't know the answers. But I wanted to. And that desire, to understand, to figure things out, became my first and greatest tool." The audience leaned in now, drawn by the gravity in Sundar's words. "You see, Daniel," Sundar said, his voice gaining strength, "it's not where you start. It's what you build inside you that defines where you go." Daniel blinked, his prepared jokes suddenly feeling hollow. He tried to steer the conversation back to humor. "Still, Sundar, you have to admit, it's a long way from a world without phones to leading Google. You must have some kind of magic formula." Sundar chuckled genuinely this time, shaking his head. "No magic, only perseverance, only the willingness to fail, and to try again." He paused, surveying the audience. "I wasn't the smartest in every room, but I stayed curious. I stayed humble, and I never allowed the laughter of others to drown out my own belief." At that moment, the screens behind them flickered to life. Without warning, a clip began to play, one that had been prepared by the studio's producers. It was a montage. Photos of a young Sundar in his modest home, snippets of him as a quiet student at IIT Kharagpur, and blurry footage of his first nerve-wracking days as a product manager at Google. The video showed a man who had risen not through arrogance or spectacle, but through relentless dedication, unshakable humility, and extraordinary vision. The studio fell silent. Daniel swallowed hard. This wasn't the interview he had imagined. This wasn't a man to be joked about. This was a man to be listened to, learned from. And somewhere in that silence, something profound happened, not just for Daniel, but for everyone watching at home. They saw, perhaps for the first time, what true greatness looked like. It didn't roar. It didn't demand attention. It simply endured. It persisted. It believed. A challenge beyond the boardroom. The days following the live broadcast were unlike anything Sundar Pichai had anticipated. Though he had not sought to impress or to grandstand, the authenticity of his words had struck a deep chord across the world. Emails flooded into Google's public inbox. Countless individuals from every corner of the globe sent letters. Some typed, many handwritten, sharing how a few minutes of Sundar's quiet strength had inspired them to believe once more in perseverance, in unseen possibilities. Yet, while millions were now talking about that interview, Sundar himself returned to his work with the same quiet focus, almost as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Success, in his mind, was never about moments of fame. It was stitched together in the endless, unseen hours of consistency, patience, and belief when no one else was looking. However, what Sundar could not foresee was that a far greater challenge than any viral moment lay just ahead. A challenge that would not test his technical skills or business acumen, but something much more profound. His ability to lead not from a throne of success, but from the vulnerable soil of crisis. Less than 3 weeks after the now famous interview, an internal issue at Google surfaced, an unforeseen disruption that, if handled poorly, could shake public trust in the company that had become almost synonymous with the internet itself. It started quietly, a whisper among engineers. A data vulnerability discovered within one of their newest AI-driven products. Though it was an issue caught early, long before it reached users, the stakes were enormous. Trust was Google's real currency, and even a perception of recklessness could cost them more than any dollar amount. In the hallowed glass-paneled conference rooms of the Googleplex, the atmosphere grew tense. Legal advisors recommended silence and deflection, a public statement crafted with 1,000 evasive words that said almost nothing. Marketing teams suggested minimizing the situation, downplaying it until the winds of public interest moved on to fresher dramas. Senior executives debated fiercely behind closed doors, voices sometimes rising above the decorous hum that usually characterized Google's leadership. Through all of it, Sundar listened, absorbing the storm around him with that same steady expression that had, over years, become his signature. He took notes, he asked questions, but he said little, letting the arguments flow and burn themselves out. When finally the room had exhausted itself into a strained silence, all eyes turned toward him, waiting for the CEO to render his verdict, to decide which form of damage control they would initiate. Sundar rose slowly, not with the stiffness of authority but with the quiet dignity of a man prepared to shoulder the burden no one else wanted to bear. He walked to the center of the room, hands in his pockets, looking thoughtfully at each member of his team before he spoke. "I understand the fear," he began, his voice calm but imbued with unmistakable gravity. "We live in a world where mistakes can spread faster than truths. But if we allow fear to dictate our response, we become something smaller than what we built this company to be." He paused, letting the words settle in. Google was founded on a simple principle: to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. You cannot be the custodian of truth if you yourself hide from it. There was a stirring among the executives, a restless unease. One of the VPs, a sharp-minded man who had risen through aggressive maneuvering, challenged him. "But Sundar, what if honesty costs us billions? What if it triggers investigations, lawsuits? Our competitors would not be so naive." Sundar turned to him, and for the first time in that long, fraught meeting, there was a steeliness in his voice that brooked no argument. "Then we lose billions," he said simply, "but we will not lose who we are." He outlined, in careful detail, a plan that would become a blueprint not just for Google's handling of crises, but for a new kind of corporate leadership in the tech industry. Immediate disclosure to the public, full cooperation with regulatory bodies, open channels of communication with users, and most importantly, an internal culture that rewarded the courage to speak up about vulnerabilities rather than the instinct to conceal them. It was not the easy path. It was, in fact, the most difficult one. But it was the right one. In the days that followed, Google held press conferences where Sundar himself answered even the harshest questions with unflinching honesty. No scripted evasions, no faceless PR shields. He stood before the world, fully visible, fully accountable. Critics initially pounced, sensing blood in the water, but as the days unfolded, a remarkable thing happened. Public trust, instead of eroding, deepened. Users, customers, and even skeptical journalists recognized the rarity and the courage of a leader choosing integrity over convenience. The potential scandal transformed, slowly but surely, into a story of resilience, responsibility, and renewal. Internally, the culture at Google began to shift in ways even Sundar had not fully predicted. Engineers felt emboldened to raise concerns early. Product teams collaborated more transparently. The entire organization began to feel, once more, like a mission rather than just a machine chasing quarterly profits. Sundar had not just navigated a crisis, he had rekindled a spirit that many feared was dying under the weight of the company's own success. One evening, long after most employees had left the sprawling campus, Sundar sat alone at his desk, the Silicon Valley twilight casting long golden shadows across his office. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Curious, he opened it. It was a video. The grainy footage showed a small school in rural India, children gathered around a makeshift television screen. They were watching a recording of his interview. That interview. A teacher, standing off camera, asked the children what they had learned. A young boy, no older than 9, stood up shyly. That you don't have to be rich to be smart, he said. You just have to stay curious and brave. Sundar watched the clip twice, 3 times, his throat tightening each time the boy spoke those simple, perfect words. In that quiet, solitary moment, he realized something profound. His greatest achievements would never be measured in stock prices, press accolades, or even in the groundbreaking products he helped create. They would be measured in the unseen ways his story gave others permission to dream larger than their circumstances, to believe in their own worth against the laughter of doubters, to walk paths lined not with applause, but with the steady footprints of perseverance. Closing his laptop gently, Sundar leaned back in his chair, gazing out at the glittering skyline. The future was still unwritten. There would be more challenges, more storms, more moments of doubt. But as long as he stayed true to his origins, to his principles, and to the quiet, relentless spirit that had carried him from Chennai's dusty streets to Silicon Valley's heights, he knew he would be ready. And somewhere, in a small village half a world away, a young boy would be watching, waiting, and preparing to write his own story of unseen triumph. The weight of expectations. The world had changed for Sundar Pichai, though he wore the changes lightly, almost invisibly, like an old traveler accustomed to carrying the weight of unseen burdens. His leadership during the crisis had not merely salvaged Google's reputation. It had elevated him into a global symbol of principled leadership. Universities invited him to speak at their commencements. Governments requested his counsel on technology policy, and CEOs of rival companies openly expressed admiration for his integrity. Yet behind the public accolades and ceremonial honors, a far heavier responsibility had begun to form, something that no interview or keynote address could prepare him for: the burden of expectation, the silent pressure of living up to the myth that the world was beginning to weave around him. In the early mornings, long before the first glimmers of California sunlight kissed the bay, Sundar would sit alone in his kitchen, a simple cup of tea warming his hands, pondering the nature of success. Was it truly success if it chained you to a pedestal you never asked for, if it made every decision not merely a choice but a symbol of something larger than yourself? Every new product launched by Google now carried with it the expectation of flawless ethics. Every corporate partnership was scrutinized through the lens of Sundar's personal values, as if he alone were the guardian of an entire industry's soul. The margin for error, once wide enough to allow for experimentation and failure, now narrowed into a razor-thin line. He was expected to walk without ever slipping. One particularly gray morning, As low clouds brooded over Mountain View, Sundar found himself called into a confidential meeting with members of Google's board of directors. The agenda, though delicately worded, carried a tone of urgency. As he entered the high-security executive suite, he noticed at once the unusual gravity in the room. Senior board members, men and women whose fortunes could buy small countries, sat with the tense, guarded expressions of people about to discuss something too serious for press releases and public relations campaigns. Without much preamble, the chairwoman leaned forward and spoke in a tone that combined admiration with an undeniable undercurrent of demand. "Sundar, you have led us brilliantly through one of the most turbulent periods in our history. You have shown the world what integrity looks like at scale, but we must ask you to consider the next step. We believe you should take on a larger role, not just within Google or Alphabet, but as a global ambassador for ethical technology." The proposal was breathtaking in its ambition. The board envisioned Sundar leading not just Google's business strategies, but setting global standards for AI ethics, privacy, data security, and even international cooperation on emerging technologies. They wanted him to be, in essence, a statesman of Silicon Valley, a figure whose influence would stretch across governments, industries, and cultures. It was a role few humans had ever occupied, a fusion of business leadership and moral authority that would place Sundar under a scrutiny and a pressure few could endure. He listened silently as they laid out their vision, his face betraying none of the storm gathering within him. When they finished, he thanked them with his usual grace and asked for time to reflect. It was granted immediately, though with clear expectations that he would see the wisdom and inevitability of the path they proposed. Later that night, as the city lights twinkled like 1,000 impatient stars, Sundar sat once more at his kitchen table, the same humble setting that had witnessed so many of his life's quiet turning points. He thought back to Chennai, to the narrow streets where the scent of street food and the clamor of life had shaped his earliest memories. He thought of his father, a modest electrical engineer who had saved for 3 years to buy the family's first scooter, and who had once told him that real greatness was measured not by how high you rose, but by how gently you touched the lives around you. Was this the right path? Could he, should he, accept the enormous mantle being thrust upon him? Or was there danger in becoming too much of a symbol, too far removed from the simple, questioning boy he had once been, the boy who marveled at the mystery of how voices travel through telephone wires? As he pondered, a memory surfaced, one he had not thought of for many years. It was the memory of his first big failure at Google, when an early project he had championed had crashed spectacularly, costing the company millions and nearly derailing his career. Back then, he had been just another mid-level manager, and the world had not cared whether he succeeded or failed. The lessons he had learned in that quiet obscurity had been priceless. Humility, resilience, the willingness to learn without ego. Would stepping into the global spotlight erode those lessons, replacing them with the brittle armor of public image? Sundar realized, with a clarity as sharp as the stars outside his window, that he could not allow himself to become a statue on a pedestal. He could serve, he could lead, but he must never become untouchable, never stop being the student even while being seen as the teacher. That night, he made a decision, not with grand proclamations or dramatic gestures, but with the quiet certainty that had always guided him. He would accept the role, but on his own terms. He would engage with global leaders, advocate for responsible technology, mentor the next generation of innovators. Yet he would also insist on maintaining his proximity to the ground, to the engineers writing code late into the night, to the users whose lives were shaped by invisible lines of programming, to the students in distant corners of the world who needed not just a symbol of success, but a reminder that success was human, imperfect, and reachable. When Sundar conveyed his decision to the board the following morning, he did so with characteristic humility. "I will accept," he said simply, "but I will remain a learner first, a leader second." There was some resistance, some negotiation, but ultimately, they agreed. Sundar Pichai, The boy from Chennai, who once marveled at the simplest telephone, would now help steer the future of technology for the entire world, not as a polished icon, but as a living embodiment of resilience, curiosity, and ethical responsibility. And somewhere, perhaps watching from a small classroom, or sitting at a rickety kitchen table half a world away, another young dreamer would look at Sundar's journey and think, if he can walk that path with such grace, maybe, just maybe, I can too. Bridges across divides. The world that Sundar Pichai now found himself shaping was not the same world that had first given rise to the dreams of a boy in Chennai. Technology, once a frontier of endless optimism, was increasingly seen through a lens of suspicion and fear. Conversations about artificial intelligence, data privacy, and digital ethics had shifted from technical conferences into the halls of governments, the chambers of the United Nations, the dinner tables of ordinary families. Sundar, who had agreed to step into the global spotlight not as a figurehead, but as an active bridge builder, now faced a challenge far more intricate than any single product launch or corporate pivot. He had to unite worlds that were drifting apart, to rebuild trust across cultures, economies, and ideologies that seemed increasingly fractured by misunderstanding. His days became endless mosaics of engagements, private sessions with tech entrepreneurs in Nairobi, roundtables with lawmakers in Brussels, candid conversations with educators in Mumbai, and midnight video calls with AI researchers scattered across time zones. Each meeting carried its own tensions, its own fragile hopes. In Europe, he was asked how American companies could be trusted with the personal data of billions. In Asia, he faced concerns that rapid automation would decimate traditional industries before governments could adapt. In North America, the fears centered around bias in algorithms, the haunting possibility that technology could unintentionally deepen social inequalities. Everywhere he went, he carried the same message. Not a promise of perfection, but a commitment to transparency, collaboration, and above all, humility. One summit in particular would etch itself deeply into Sundar's memory. It was a technology ethics forum, held at an ancient university in Oxford, a place where the very stones seemed to whisper the accumulated wisdom of centuries. The gathering brought together a startlingly diverse group: computer scientists, philosophers, economists, political leaders, and even spiritual figures. The air buzzed with an almost visible tension, the weight of centuries of human conflict and cooperation compressed into a few high-ceilinged rooms. On the second day, during a session open to the public, a young philosophy student stood up, her voice clear and unwavering despite the audience of dignitaries. "Mr. Pichai," she said, locking eyes with him across the amphitheater, "how can we trust technology companies to regulate themselves when history teaches us that power always seeks to protect itself first? How do you propose to build bridges when you are standing on a fortress?" The room fell into a hush so profound it seemed the very walls leaned in to listen. Sundar did not rush to answer. He let the question hang in the air, honoring its weight. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, but carried to every corner of the hall. "I cannot ask you to trust corporations," he said. "Trust must be earned, not demanded. And you are right. History reminds us again and again that unchecked power corrupts, even among those with the best intentions. But here is what I believe. The future will not be built by corporations alone, nor by governments, nor by any single group. It must be a collective act, a shared responsibility." He paused, scanning the faces before him, skeptical, hopeful, wary. Technology at its best is a bridge, not a fortress. But bridges are fragile structures. They require constant maintenance. They require open roads, not closed gates. They require all of us, engineers, lawmakers, philosophers, citizens, to walk them together, to repair them when they crack, to strengthen them when storms come. The student nodded slowly, and around the hall, an almost imperceptible shift occurred. Skepticism softened into a willingness to listen, to engage. It was not victory. Sundar had never sought victory. It was, instead, the beginning of something infinitely more precious: dialogue. In the weeks that followed, Sundar and his team spearheaded new initiatives that were unprecedented in Silicon Valley's history. Google opened its AI research to independent audits, invited ethicists and human rights advocates into its product design meetings, and co-authored guidelines for emerging technologies with nonprofits and international watchdogs. The initiatives were messy, imperfect, and sometimes painfully slow, but they were real. Sundar knew that building genuine bridges was a labor not of days or months, but of generations. Yet even as he expanded his role on the global stage, Sundar never abandoned his commitment to stay grounded. He insisted on maintaining a regular schedule of meetings with junior engineers, sitting in on brainstorming sessions where ideas were raw and unpolished, unguarded by the layers of corporate diplomacy that so often insulated leaders from reality. It was in one such meeting, a casual late-night hackathon hosted in a small Google campus outside of Zurich, that Sundar encountered an idea that would ignite the next phase of his mission. A group of young developers from different countries had been working quietly on a project they called Lingua, an AI-powered platform designed not to replace human communication, but to enhance understanding across languages and cultural contexts. The prototype was rough, almost embarrassingly so by Google's usual standards, but it carried within it a vision of breathtaking beauty. A world where no child was ever isolated from knowledge because of the accident of their birth language. A world where understanding could flow more freely than ever before. Sundar stayed long after the formal presentations ended, sitting cross-legged on the carpeted floor with the young team, peppering them with questions, sketching diagrams with a borrowed marker on a whiteboard. The excitement in the room was electric, a reminder of everything he had always loved about technology. Not the power, not the prestige, but the simple, extraordinary act of building something that could bring people closer together. When he finally left the Zurich office, the first light of dawn was just beginning to silver the mountains. Sundar stood for a moment in the parking lot, breathing in the crisp air, his mind racing not with strategies or shareholder concerns, but with a pure, unfiltered sense of possibility. In a world increasingly defined by its divisions, perhaps technology could indeed be a bridge, not just between data points, but between hearts, between hopes, between dreams that otherwise might remain forever separated. He knew it would not be easy. There would be failures, critics, setbacks. The bridges would sometimes break under the weight of old fears and new misunderstandings. But Sundar Pichai, the boy who had once marveled at a simple telephone in a modest home in Chennai, had learned one unshakable truth: it was worth it. Every bridge built, however fragile, was a thread stitching the world closer together. And as long as he could, he would keep building. The fire within. Seasons turned as quietly and surely as the tide, and Sundar Pichai, more than ever before, found himself moving between worlds: the boardrooms of billion-dollar industries, the classrooms of remote villages, the crowded halls of global summits, and the hushed, focused energy of innovation labs scattered across continents. With the launch of the Lingua project, his vision had begun to take new shape, transcending mere product development to become a mission to bridge the fractured human experience through the very tools that had once threatened to isolate it. Yet even as success stories began to unfold, students in rural Kenya using Lingua to access scientific journals, displaced refugees in Europe finding new opportunities through translated vocational training. Sundar knew that beneath the surface, darker forces were stirring. The more visible he became as a figure of global leadership, the more he attracted scrutiny not just from critics, but from those who saw change as a threat. Old structures resisted the dissolving of barriers. Vested interests recoiled at the idea of information becoming truly universal. In corporate circles, whispers began to circulate that Sundar's initiatives were idealistic distractions from real business. In political corridors, there were accusations that empowering the powerless could destabilize established orders. News articles, once filled with glowing admiration, now occasionally bore headlines tinged with skepticism, questioning whether Sundar's vision was naive in a world hardened by centuries of division. For a man who had always preferred the quiet certainty of action over the noisy theater of perception, the growing storms were exhausting in ways he could not easily explain. Late at night, when he finally returned to his home, often greeted by the quiet flicker of lights his wife had left on for him, he would feel the weight of doubt creeping in. Had he overreached? Was it possible that in trying to bridge the world, he was merely offering it a target too large to ignore? It was during one of these long, solitary nights that an unexpected letter arrived. Written by hand on rough fibrous paper, the letter had no official letterhead, no return address beyond a simple note. From a friend. Intrigued, Sundar unfolded the pages and began to read. The letter told the story of a young man from a small war-torn village, a place where opportunity was a foreign concept, where survival was the only daily goal. This young man had stumbled across Lingua by accident while seeking shelter in a refugee camp. Through it, he had taught himself English, mathematics, and basic programming. And now, months later, he had secured a scholarship to a university, something that had been unthinkable not long before. "You do not know me," the letter ended, "but you saved my life. You gave me a bridge where there was only a wall. Please, do not stop." Sundar sat very still, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. It was not the grand accolades of governments or the applause of corporate shareholders that brought meaning to his work. It was this: the unseen ripples, the lives quietly lifted by the invisible hands of hope. Revitalized by this unexpected reminder, Sundar made a decision that would once again defy the cautious advice of those around him. He would double down, not retreat. He would expand Lingua into a new global initiative called One Voice, a broader platform designed not only to translate, but to connect local knowledge systems, to preserve endangered languages, to ensure that wisdom born from every corner of the earth would not be lost to time or globalization. The undertaking was enormous, a logistical and technological labyrinth. It meant forging partnerships with universities, NGOs, indigenous communities, and even rival tech companies, many of whom had long histories of distrust. It demanded investments with no immediate return, collaborations fraught with cultural sensitivities, and the patience to navigate bureaucracies that moved slower than glaciers. But Sundar was not deterred. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the most important things in life were not those that could be measured by quarterly reports. They were the things that lived and breathed in the spaces between statistics, in the widened eyes of a girl reading a story in her native tongue for the first time, in the wrinkled smile of an elder hearing his people's songs echoed back from a device built thousands of miles away. He poured himself into the project with a fire that surprised even his closest colleagues. In meeting after meeting, he sat with translators and linguists, anthropologists and engineers, listening more than he spoke, asking questions that drilled down to the heart of things. How could technology amplify, rather than erase, human diversity? How could it empower without homogenizing? How could it remember, honor, and protect the voices that history had so often silenced? As months rolled into years, One Voice began to bear fruit. Entire libraries of indigenous knowledge, once trapped in oral traditions vulnerable to extinction, were now digitized, translated, and shared with the world. Languages on the brink of disappearing found new speakers among curious students across continents. Forgotten histories, once smothered by the dominant narratives of empire and conquest, found new life in digital archives accessible to anyone with an internet connection. And as this quiet revolution unfolded, Sundar's own understanding of leadership deepened. He came to see that true leadership was not about commanding armies or dominating markets. It was about creating spaces where others could rise, where voices long drowned out by the roar of history could finally be heard. It was about holding the doors open, not for the applause that might follow, but because it was the right thing to do. Yet even as the light of his vision spread, Sundar knew there would always be shadows, forces that preferred walls to bridges, isolation to connection. But he had made peace with that. His life's work was not to eliminate darkness, but to stubbornly, relentlessly, and quietly build candles against it, one small flame at a time. And somewhere, in countless places he would never see, those flames were already flickering to life. In the smile of a child discovering her own history in her own words, in the tears of an old man hearing his childhood songs anew, in the dreams of a refugee who no longer saw only barriers, but paths waiting to be walked. Sundar Pichai, the boy who had once squinted at the simple wonder of a telephone line, running across a dusty street in Chennai, had become something he had never set out to be. A custodian of dreams, a builder of bridges, a guardian of human possibility. And he was just getting started. Beyond the horizon, time, with its tireless wings, carried Sundar Pichai ever forward into new and uncharted territories of responsibility. The One Voice initiative had grown from a hopeful experiment into a worldwide movement, connecting millions of people who had once lived on the margins of history and progress. It would have been easy, even understandable, for Sundar to pause there, to rest in the soft glow of achievement, to allow himself the comfort of believing the work was done. But Sundar had long understood a profound truth that most never grasp. Every summit reached reveals 1,000 higher peaks beyond it, and the real journey is never measured by accolades, but by the willingness to keep climbing, even when no one is watching, even when the air grows thin and the path disappears into mist. As the 5th anniversary of Lingua approached, Google's sprawling headquarters prepared for a celebration unlike any before. Not the typical corporate gala festooned with polished marketing videos and rehearsed speeches, but a global summit bringing together everyone whose lives had been touched by the project. Linguists, teachers, tribal elders, students, poets, and dreamers from every continent. Invitations were sent not in gold-embossed envelopes, but as simple handwritten notes where possible, translated into dozens of native languages, inviting people not as representatives of demographics or markets, but as individuals whose stories mattered. In the weeks leading up to the summit, Sundar was approached by advisors with a proposal, a grand keynote address, streamed to billions, positioning him officially as not just a tech visionary, but a humanitarian leader. There was pressure, subtle but undeniable, to craft a speech that would cement his legacy, that would paint him in the glowing hues history reserved for its celebrated figures. But Sundar, true to the boy who had once stared at a telephone wire in wonder, resisted the temptation to be painted as a monument. Instead, on the morning of the summit, under a brilliant California sun, Sundar chose to open the event not with a speech about himself, but with a stage given over entirely to others. One by one, ordinary people came forward. A young woman from a remote island who had used Lingua to preserve her grandmother's dying language. A boy from a refugee camp who had become a published poet, his verses now translated into dozens of tongues. A former factory worker who, through the platform, had become a teacher of endangered dialects. Their stories, raw and luminous, poured into the crowd like rivers converging into an ocean, a tapestry woven not by one hand, but by countless hands reaching across divides. Sundar sat quietly in the front row, listening, his heart swelling not with pride, but with a deep, almost painful gratitude. He understood with crystalline clarity that true leadership was not about how brightly you could shine, but how many others you could help to ignite their own lights. Yet even as the celebrations unfolded with joyous authenticity, Sundar could not escape a growing realization pressing at the edges of his consciousness. The next great challenge would not be technological, but philosophical. The world was accelerating at an unprecedented pace. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, quantum computing. The forces he and others had helped unleash were evolving faster than humanity's moral frameworks could adapt. Sundar foresaw a future shimmering with unimaginable possibilities, but also darkened by potential catastrophes. If left unguided, these new powers could widen inequality, deepen mistrust, and automate empathy out of existence. In the quiet moments after the summit ended, when the lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed, Sundar walked alone along the tree-lined paths of the Googleplex. His mind churned, not with strategies or product roadmaps, but with the haunting, vital question: how do we prepare humanity not just to use the tools of tomorrow, but to deserve them? The answer, he knew, would not be found in faster processors or sleeker devices. It would be found in hearts, in minds, in the ancient, stubborn work of cultivating wisdom, compassion, and resilience in a world increasingly seduced by speed and spectacle. Sundar realized that his next mission must be to spark a global conversation about digital ethics, not as an afterthought, but as the foundation of innovation itself. Thus was born the idea for a new initiative, the Horizon Project, a global educational movement dedicated to weaving ethical literacy into the fabric of technological advancement. It would start with the youngest minds, embedding critical thinking, empathy, cultural understanding, and responsibility into the way children learn to interact with technology. It would engage universities, governments, NGOs, artists, and philosophers, creating a living dialogue that refused to let innovation outrun wisdom. Once again, Sundar's advisors warned him of the risks. Horizon would be expensive, difficult to scale, hard to measure in terms of immediate success. Investors might grow restless. Political actors might resist what they perceived as an attempt to introduce moral oversight into traditionally unregulated spaces. But Sundar had already accepted that true leadership was not about steering the ship toward calm waters. It was about navigating into storms when the horizon itself demanded a new course. In the months that followed, Sundar traveled not just to tech conferences, but to monasteries, indigenous councils, struggling inner-city schools, and distant villages where the glow of a screen was still a novelty. Everywhere he went, he asked variations of the same question: what kind of world are we building, and who do we want to become? The responses humbled him. A Buddhist monk spoke of mindfulness as the operating system for human consciousness. A tribal elder shared myths that taught balance between power and humility. A young coder in Brazil argued passionately for ethics embedded not as rules, but as reflexes in machine learning algorithms. These fragments, disparate and diverse, began to form a mosaic of hope, a roadmap not of technology alone, but of character, of soul. As the Horizon Project launched, Sundar watched the first pilot programs roll out. Schools in Nairobi integrating ethics discussions into coding classes, tech incubators in Southeast Asia requiring startups to design with societal impact evaluations, AI conferences setting aside keynote time for philosophers and poets, not just programmers. It was messy, imperfect, unfinished, but it was real. And for Sundar Pichai, it was the beginning of a new measure of success. Not the speed of downloads or the size of profits, but the depth of understanding, the breadth of empathy, the resilience of humanity's shared dream. As he stood once more at a crossroads, Sundar looked out at the horizon, not with fear, not with pride, but with the same quiet, insatiable curiosity that had always been his true compass. He did not know exactly what lay beyond that shimmering edge of tomorrow, but he knew he would walk toward it, not alone, but with millions walking beside him, across bridges they would build together. And somewhere, in a small house tucked away on a distant street, maybe in Chennai, maybe in Nairobi, maybe in a place yet unnamed, a young boy or girl was watching, learning, dreaming. Because the measure of a dream was never how far it reached alone. It was how many other dreams it awakened along the way. The legacy of light. The years that followed saw a transformation so profound it could scarcely be captured in statistics or headlines. Technology continued its relentless advance, but it did so with new hands guiding its creation, hands that had been touched by the seeds Sundar Pichai had quietly planted across the world. From small community centers to vast urban universities, from isolated tribal villages to the glass towers of major cities, the conversations around innovation had shifted subtly but irrevocably. No longer was progress measured only by speed or efficiency. Increasingly, it was measured by its capacity to uplift, to heal, to unite rather than divide. Sundar's vision, once seen as idealistic, had become a living, breathing part of the global dialogue. And yet, even amidst the quiet triumphs of initiatives like Lingua and the Horizon Project, Sundar remained, at his core, unchanged. He was still the same man who preferred walking the back corridors of Google campuses to sitting in corner offices, who still listened more than he spoke, who still approached each meeting with the humility of a student rather than the entitlement of a master. Fame, for him, was a responsibility to deflect, not a prize to hoard. Power was a tool to share, not a throne to defend. In every action, every decision, Sundar continued to embody the simple, profound truth he had known since childhood, that real greatness is found not in being worshipped, but in serving something greater than oneself. It was in the middle of one quiet afternoon. The sky outside his office a soft wash of blue and gold, that Sundar received an invitation that would mark a turning point, not for his career, but for his life. A global educational consortium, independent and non-political, wished to establish a new institution, the Academy of Tomorrow, a place where future generations would be trained not only in the sciences and technologies of the future, but in the ethics, philosophies, and cross-cultural wisdom needed to steward those powers wisely. They did not ask Sundar to fund it, to brand it, or to market it. They asked only one thing, that he come to speak to its very first graduating class. The ceremony was set for the summer solstice, at a modest but beautiful campus built at the crossroads of 3 countries, symbolizing unity beyond borders. The academy was not grand in size, but it pulsed with a quiet energy, a sense of beginning that felt almost sacred. Students milled about in plain robes, their faces radiant, not with entitlement but with earnestness, with the electric hope of those who sensed the future was not something to inherit passively, but to shape deliberately. As Sundar stepped onto the small wooden stage, he felt a deep, grounding peace settle over him. There were no teleprompters, no carefully curated PR teams in sight, just rows and rows of young people whose dreams shimmered around them like invisible banners. He looked out at them, taking in the vast diversity of skin tones, languages, traditions, hopes, all converging here, all reaching beyond the horizon he had once walked toward alone. He spoke without notes, without rehearsed gestures. His voice was steady, carrying the soft strength of a man who had long ago made peace with both his limits and his possibilities. "When I was your age," he began, "I lived in a house smaller than this stage. I shared a room with my brother, studied by dim light, and dreamed dreams that felt too big for the narrow streets around me. I did not know how to build the future. I only knew how to stay curious, to stay humble, to keep moving even when the path was invisible." He paused, letting the wind stir his words across the open field. "The tools you hold today are more powerful than anything my generation could have imagined. But they are just tools. It is your character, your compassion, your courage that will determine whether they build bridges or walls, whether they heal wounds or widen them. The future is not waiting to be discovered. It is waiting to be created. By you." A silence settled over the crowd, not the emptiness of disinterest, but the fullness of minds racing ahead, of hearts leaning forward. Sundar smiled, a small, gentle smile that carried the weight of a lifetime's understanding. "Never measure your worth by how much you are applauded," he said. "Measure it by how many others you lift along the way. Never fear the darkness. Light your small candle, and trust, truly trust, that it matters." He ended with a simple bow, a gesture of respect, not from a titan addressing subjects, but from a traveler saluting fellow travelers. As he stepped down from the stage, the applause that rose behind him was not thunderous. It was something rarer, a deep, sustained wave of gratitude, of connection, of recognition between souls who understood they were part of something infinitely larger than themselves. As Sundar walked alone beneath the wide open sky, he thought not of his own journey, but of theirs, the students who would now carry forward the dream, the millions more they would touch, the countless futures they would help build. His own role, he knew, would continue quietly, humbly, invisibly in the background, like the steady pulse of a telephone wire carrying voices across impossible distances. Years later, long after Sundar himself had stepped back from public life, the world would look back and see not a monument, not a celebrity, but a movement. A slow, stubborn, breathtaking shift toward a world where technology served humanity's highest ideals, not its lowest impulses. A world where dreams, no matter how small their beginnings, were honored, nurtured, and given the space to grow. And somewhere, in a bustling city, or a quiet village, or a distant future not yet born, a child would lift their face to the stars, wondering how far they could go. Because once, long ago, a boy in Chennai had dared to ask the same question, and the echo of his dream had never stopped moving.